All right, now that Diddy has been denied bail, we know that he's going to be in custody pending trial, and trial is set for May of 2025. That date could certainly move later in the year, but right now we have trial set for May of 2025. And the big question is going to be revealed is a jury, if this thing ends up going to trial, are they going to find Diddy guilty of sex trafficking? And that's what I want to dive into in this video. You may have been sort of scratching your head because when you look at the relationship, it doesn't exactly on its face appear to be sex trafficking, right? But how did the government come up with this allegation, and are they in the end going to be able to prove that? We're going to dive into some of those issues. I want to welcome you back if you've watched one of my videos before. If you don't know me, my name is Jamahl Kersey. I am a criminal defense attorney. I've been practicing law for over 15 years. And on this channel, we're breaking down legal concepts so you are in the know. And before I dive in, I just want to take a quick moment to recognize Shawty for the gift. I very much appreciate it. Thanks so much. All right, so let's dive into this. The government's case is essentially that Puff is an abusive person. He's been a physical, mental, emotional abuser for many years, and people around him have either signed off on it, essentially condoned it, helped cover it up, or taken a blind eye to it. And the interesting thing about the way the indictment is written is it talks about women in the plural, but yet we have one victim that the indictment seems to be centered around, and that's Kersey Ventura, right? So it talks about him abusing women, and you see plural all throughout the indictment. But I think, you know, and this could be subject to change. They could put on multiple women who claim to have been abused by Puff over the years, or it could just be the one Kersey Ventura. There also could be another indictment coming down the road. We know that the U.S. Attorney's Office had announced that the investigation was ongoing and continuing, which means, and there's also, you know, grand jury proceedings that seem to be continuing to go along. So they have more and more people testifying about what they personally experienced or what they observed, and that could lead to another indictment. That would be a superseding indictment, which may name other parties and which may name additional charges against Puff or other people. And one of the things that people have been asking is, well, if they're charging a racketeering conspiracy and there's these other people involved, how come there's no one else named in this indictment? And that's a really good question. The government charges that there is a Combs enterprise, and that's comprised of multiple people. So this was not just Diddy acting alone in this situation. But the reason why I would gather that no one else is being charged at this point is because there are probably people cooperating. You know, at the end of the day, the people who would be part of, you know, this quote unquote Combs enterprise would be people with just regular jobs, right? There would be people who might be accountants, people who are marketers and graphic designers and clothing designers and security personnel and high level managers and things like that, right? And so these are just people who have a regular 9-to-5. They just happen to work for Diddy, right? So they're not criminal minded gangsters. They would be very easy people to flip if you have federal agents saying, hey, listen, this guy's been doing some really dirty stuff for years, and unless you want to go down with him, right, because I have you coordinating flights, I have you booking hotels, I have you, you know, arranging for transportation on the ground, or, you know, whatever the situation is. And so for the person doing these, I don't want to say innocent things, but seemingly not so serious things, being caught up into what you are now being revealed to as being a racketeering conspiracy with sex trafficking charges, those people are going to do whatever they can to save themselves and get out from under this situation. And so that's the perfect person for the feds to flip into cooperating with them. And that's how the federal government would have all these details in terms of how everything operated and how everything went down. So obviously Kersey, especially having been in a relationship with Diddy for so long, she's going to have a lot of insider knowledge in terms of, kind of depending on how much Diddy revealed to her or not, right? Just because you're in a relationship with somebody doesn't mean that you know the in and outs and in and outer workings of their various business entities. So she may have had some of the information, she may have not, but some of these people who have been working with him would absolutely have insider knowledge on how all this stuff worked, especially if they were participating in it. So the allegation is that Puff basically leveraged his power and prestige of himself as Sean Diddy Combs, owner of Bad Boy, marketer, entrepreneur, being a billionaire, right? That's going to be a very attractive, eligible bachelor, right? And so he would lure these women in, under the pretense of a romantic relationship, and then that would be turned into exploiting those very women for the purpose of, fulfilling his sexual desires. And again, in the indictment, you see that it's talking about victims in the plural, but unless and until they demonstrate that there were other, victims of this sex trafficking, it seems that we're only talking about Cassie Ventura. And that certainly would be enough, right? They don't need to have a whole string of victims in this case in order to prove their case. But it just is interesting how they use victims in the plural versus just in the singular. So the major accusation in this case is that Combs recruited and made victim one, who's Cassie Ventura, to engage in commercial sex acts, knowing that she was only doing so as a result of force, fraud, or coercion. And so there's quite a bit to unpack there. And one of the things is the sex trafficking. Now, if you're like me, when you think of sex trafficking, it's probably not this situation that we're talking about here. You may, think in your mind, foreign women being packed up and exploited for the purpose of prostitution, right? Promising them lucrative careers as models, and then they flip that into, okay, but you're gonna have to have sex to do this. But sex trafficking as its core just means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. So when it comes to commercial sex act, that can include a prostitution, it can include pornography, and other sexual acts performed in exchange for money, drugs, alcohol, shelter, food, or clothes. So now we get into the freak off, right? And so the freak off were these elaborate sexual performances that were arranged and put together by and for Puff. And they said that he would record them sometimes and that he would masturbate to them. A billionaire, again, allegedly being able to fulfill his sexual desires in ways that people without all of these resources to be able to leverage, they probably wouldn't be able to get this done in the same way. And that's how you get into racketeering, because, racketeering is essentially just, organized crime, right? Versus just one person doing illegal activity. Racketeering is going to be the organized crime. And the racket can be anything from sex trafficking, as we have alleged here. It can be money laundering. It can be illegal gambling. It can be a prostitution ring, drug trafficking. It could be illegal firearm sales. So, there's all kinds of different rackets you can have, but really we're talking about organized crime and the idea that there's no way that Puff would have been able to do this alone. And so what they say is the Combs enterprise helped with the transportation, right? So they had to get these sex workers, if they're talking about being in Miami, or they were going to be in LA, or they were going to be in New York. So they had to arrange for the transportation. They had to arrange for hotel bookings. They had to get the drugs, because there's also the allegations that drugs were being used at these parties in order to get people to do what it was that Diddy wanted them to do. And so the government lays out the ways in which he was able to get the victims to participate. And that would either be through actual physical violence or the threat of physical violence. It would be the promises of career opportunities. And so that would be something like, I could sign you to Bad Boy, right? I've produced all kinds of stars. Or I've got friends, I could connect you with someone else. You want to be in the movies, I could get you in a movie. You want to be on TV, I could get you on TV. You want to be a dancer, I'll get you on that stage, right? There was also either giving or the withholding of financial support, right? So you get somebody, so dependent on you financially. The idea is that I'm going to withhold financial support from you. It's like, where are you going to live? How are you going to eat? Where are you going to get clothes, right? All these different type of ways that you can control somebody financially. There would also be the threatening of careers and livelihoods if someone refused to participate in the freak off, right? So you're going to continue to do this or your career is over. There's also the allegation that because Diddy recorded these freak offs, he had some pretty incriminating evidence to be able to use as blackmail, right? So you're going to perform in this, or I'm going to release a copy of these freak offs. And if you imagine, if we are just talking about Cassie and we're talking about her engaged in sex acts with multiple sex workers, that's something, that is intimate, right? That's not something that's supposed to be for the whole world to see. And that would be extremely embarrassing and also career threatening, and just something that somebody would not want put out for the whole world to see. And so again, that could be used as leverage to get them to continue to do what it is that they don't want to do. And this is essentially where the violence comes in, because the Combs Enterprise was also alleged to have maintained weapons and really, just thrown their muscle around to keep people under control. And Diddy himself would also use firearms to exert his control over his victims. And so what it comes down to is that Cassie was a part of these freak offs and didn't want to do it. She didn't want to be there. She didn't want to perform at these things. She was essentially forced to have sex with people that she didn't want to have sex with. If this is actually true, then this is obviously disgusting, right? I mean, we do have to think about, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters in your lives. And if one of them were made to, be forced to have sex with people that they didn't want to have sex with, then, that's just really unthinkable. But obviously there are two sides to every story, and the defense's position is that everything was consensual. And this is why they're coming out and saying that Puff is innocent. And again, I don't know. And if we're being honest, you don't know either, right? A lot of people, depending on where they land on this, if they're saying that, Puff is evil and he did all these things, or they're saying that Puff is, the man still and he didn't do all these things, it seems to be, a big division based on fandom, right? Like, were you a big fan of Puff? And if so, then you're giving him the benefit of the doubt and he didn't do these things. Or if you don't like him as a person and you just see him as a pig and you just imagining him doing all these things, then you absolutely believe everybody who's made any sort of accusation against him. And for me, I'm a fan of the artist. I'm a fan of the music producer. I'm a fan of the businessman. I was inspired by, all three of those roles and more, but, at the end of the day, for a defense attorney, as I'm looking at this evidence, I'm sitting here saying, what the government alleges could be true, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? And by me saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be, that doesn't mean that I'm being disrespectful towards Cassie. That doesn't mean that, I don't believe that we should believe women. And I've talked to prospective jurors about this in jury selection. I tell them, hey, listen, your role as a juror, you are a fact finder. So that's a different role from, let's just say, if your daughter reported someone having, violated her in some way. You're not playing the role of a fact finder in that situation. If it's your daughter, you're there to comfort her. You're there to listen to them, right? You're not picking apart what they're saying to you and, pushing back and being, playing devil's advocate or even, cross-examining in your mind. No, that's not your role. But as a fact finder, emotions and sympathy are not supposed to play any part in your analysis of this situation. And so when we hear that the defense is saying that all of this was consensual and she was never forced to do anything that she ultimately did with Puff, like, we have to look at that and say, well, is this a possibility? And I would say, sure, it is a possibility, right? And she could have, been drunk at some of these freak offs. She could have been under the influence of all kinds of drugs during these freak offs and still wanted to do it, right? I mean, that's not beyond the realm of possibility. They were in this relationship, and some people have just different lifestyles. I mean, you have people who are in the polyamory, and you could be married and have different girlfriends. Some people have multiple wives. Like, people have alternative lifestyles. And so for them to have been in this relationship for around 10 years, and it takes all this time for her to come out and say something. And again, there's all kinds of reasons why people sometimes either delay reporting or don't report at all. But the defense's position is going to be, hey, listen, how this whole thing kicked off. It wasn't that she went directly to law enforcement and reported this. No, she had her lawyers contact Puff's lawyers and say, hey, we're going to put out a book, and you can buy the exclusive rights to this book. And if you do, then this story will never see the light of day. But if you don't, then I'm going to put this story out. What they asked for, in exchange for the exclusive rights of this book, it was $30 million. That's a lot of money. And I'm not going to say, like, if she was forced to do these things, then maybe $30 million isn't enough money, right? I mean, I can't imagine what number you put on being violated sexually, right? But, the defense's position is going to be, no, she didn't go straight to law enforcement. She went for a money grab. And when Puff and his lawyers, rejected that, that's when, they end up filing this lawsuit. And ultimately, a business decision was made to settle this lawsuit early on, and that was that. And it wasn't until that this whole criminal investigation started off, right? So she stuck around for all these years. She took all the fancy trips. She stayed all the fancy hotels. She rode in the beautiful cars. She walked all the red carpets. She received all the fancy gifts. There's going to be people on Puff's team that are going to say, like, I never saw anything that appeared to be her not wanting to take a part of what she did, right? And there's going to be these videos and everything. And so the defense's position is and has always been that this was a toxic relationship. And yes, there was domestic violence, but that doesn't make Puff a sex trafficker. Every single freak off that she participated in, that she wanted to be there. And it doesn't matter that, that she was drunk or that she was high. There was never any question as to whether she wanted to be there and whether she was, whether or not she was willingly participating. And that's not an unreasonable interpretation of the evidence, but it's really going to come down to the testimony. I mean, at the end of the day, Cassie will end up having to testify, and she'll be able to tell her whole story. She'll lay out how they met and the details of their relationship. But again, she's going to be subject to cross-examination on these issues. And then the jury will have to decide, do they really believe that she was forced to do these things, that she was coerced, they fraudulently made her participate in these sex acts, or was it just something that she willingly participated in with her boyfriend who had these, off the wall sexual desires, and in the end, she just exploited him for a money grab? That's what this whole thing comes down to. And so there have been a number of civil lawsuits that have been filed, and I think on some level that definitely has had an impact and an influence on how people are seeing this criminal case. But again, what you have to understand is these civil cases and the criminal case are two completely different situations, and there's different standards and proof involved. In a civil case, you only have to prove that it's more likely than not, right? So you're just basically tipping the scales, right? On a criminal case, the government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the charges are true. And that's a much higher standard than these civil cases. So when it comes down to it, I think a jury may not be too fond of Diddy at the end of a trial with all the allegations of domestic violence and all this kind of stuff. But him being a violent person doesn't make him a sex trafficker. So he can have been a violent person and her still willingly have participated in these freak-offs, right? From the defense's perspective, there's going to have been a huge financial incentive for her to have exaggerated things, for her to have lied about things, and for her to have, manipulated and spun things, because again, the defense is not going to deny the existence of freak-offs. They're not going to say that these things never happened. What they're saying is that she willingly participated in them. I definitely think there's going to be a huge battle in the government trying to ultimately prove their case. But let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think that the government has an airtight case against Puff, or do you think that the defense has a chance here? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and if you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you'll like this one, so make sure you check it out.